Chapter 12. The Captain's Friend. "Blast it, Si, what in the world have you done to your hair?" I stood in the doorway to Payun's cabin, patting the back of my newly exposed neck. "I cut it, sir." "I can see that," he bellowed, "and now it's too short to tie back. The wind will constantly be thrashing it over your face while you're on deck." I frowned, pretending that's not exactly what I had planned. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't think of that. I was just worried about lice." I ran my fingers through the blunt strands, still a little shocked that they stopped just under my chin. I had tried to copy Miss Ryan's hairstyle, but with only a pair of work shears and no mirror, I was sure I hadn't succeeded. Oh well, I didn't need it to look nice. I needed it to disguise me from Grebe. "Yes, well, you'll soon learn which is more annoying," grumbled Payun. "An itchy head or not being able to take a latitude reading." He reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out his brass quadrant. "You can test out your foolishness now. Remember what I taught you?" I nodded as I took the heavy piece of equipment from him. "Hold steady," I recited, "and sight the sun through the scope." "First," he exclaimed. "What do you do first?" I sighed. "Sorry. First, lower the shade over the lens so the sun doesn't burn my eyeball. Sight the sun and measure the angle using the scale on the side." "And how do you keep still so you can take an accurate reading?" I planted my feet in a wide stance the way he'd shown me the day before. "Keep loose in the knees. Let my hips sway with the ship." Yes. Now take 3 separate readings and come back and report them to me." He leaned back and pointed to the chart spread out in front of him. "Then we'll record it and let the captain know how much longer until our first stop at Pitaya Island. Go on, or you'll miss high noon." I left him and climbed the stairs to the quarterdeck. I paused before taking the last step. It was Grebe's watch, and I was almost sure to run into him. A part of me still wanted to hide, but I needed to test out my new disguise. I found a place to stand at the rail out of the way of the ever-busy crew. I held up the quadrant and began taking the first reading. Payun was right about the hair. The breeze flicked it across my face, covering the scope lens and blocking my view of the sun. But with my face hidden, I also felt protected, as if I were in my own little bubble. I steadied my feet to take the reading again. As the ship dipped down and rose back up, I rocked on my toes and swayed my hips so I wouldn't get knocked off balance. "That's an interesting dance," said an amused voice behind me. I whirled around to face a field of black silk and jet buttons. Miss Ryan pushed her own dark locks behind her ears, giving me a look at her face for the first time. Her skin was as smooth and pale as fresh butter in a jar. She smiled, and her dark eyes lifted at the corners. "I like the haircut." I blushed as I bowed, embarrassed that it was so obvious I had copied her. "Oh, thank you. I was just worried about lice. Not that I have lice, I just didn't want to get any, so—" She nodded as if I weren't babbling on like a fool. "I think short hair suits you, and it's nice to make a change when you start something big and new, isn't it?" I quit babbling and smiled back. "Yes, it is, miss." "Please call me Ryan," she said warmly. "And I know you're Si. I heard you and Master Payun talking in his cabin this morning. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but he wasn't exactly whispering." I blushed again, realizing that she must have heard him scolding me for cutting my hair. I liked her even more now for complimenting it. "He can be a little grumpy sometimes, but he's a good man to work for." "The very best, from what I hear." She leaned her elbow against the rail. The salt that had crusted there rubbed onto the black silk of her sleeve, but she didn't seem to care. "So tell me, what do you think about life aboard the Prosperity so far?" I stumbled over my answer, then stumbled again as Ryan asked me more polite questions. As we chatted, I tried to decide how old she was. She must have been near the captain's age, since they were friends, but she seemed much younger. With her bright eyes and the playful way her nose twitched when she was making a joke, she reminded me of the black kitten that lived behind Payun's shop. She laughed easily, and it didn't take long before I was laughing along with her. The sunlight glinted off her lineal brooch, drawing my eyes toward it. A chain of 5 links hung from the ends of a small gold bar that was pinned to her jacket. She must have noticed me looking at it. "I really should take this thing off," she said. "It's probably tacky to be showing it off up here on deck, but it's fairly new, and I guess I'm still a little proud of it." "It's new?" I asked. It was a strange thing for someone over the age of 13 to say. She nodded and ran her finger over the links. "This is a lineal of honor, given out by the Queen herself for acts of great bravery." She said the last part in a fancy accent. Apparently, Her Majesty decided that nearly getting killed in battle is worth the same as 5 generations of good breeding. I blinked, taking all this in. I had never heard of a lineal of honor, and it was just as much of a surprise to hear that Miss Ryan had once served in battle. "You were in the war?" She shrugged. "Not for long. My act of great bravery landed me in the hospital. By the time I recovered, the fighting was nearly over. Here, do you want to see?" Ryan turned to face away from me. She ran her hand up the back of her neck, lifting her hair. At the base of her skull, there was a patchy bald spot and a thick pink scar. They had to shave my head to sew me back together. I looked like a monk for months. She laughed, but I was ashamed of myself for listening to Mr. Lark's gossip that first day on board. He had called her a peacock, when really she was a war hero. "If you don't mind me asking, miss, what did you do?" Ryan glanced up at the top deck where Captain Sangra stood with her officers. "Got between a swinging saber and the Queen's great niece." I sucked in a breath and rubbed the back of my own skull. So that explained why Ryan looked so at ease on the ship, and why she and the captain seemed so comfortable with each other. They had been through a war together, and Ryan had saved Captain Sangra's life. She turned to me and put her hand on my shoulder. "Uh-oh, I've upset you, haven't I? I'm sorry. This isn't exactly the stuff of pleasant conversation." "Oh no, it's not that." I tugged at a lock of my newly chopped hair. "It's just that, well, now I feel ashamed that I cut my hair like yours, when you had to do it because you were injured." She laughed, and her dark eyes danced. "Don't be silly. I'm absolutely flattered that you did. There's no shame in having good taste, which clearly you do." I could feel a warmth spreading over me from where her hand still rested on my shoulder, but the feeling chilled as I glanced to the center of the quarterdeck. Grebe stood below the mizzenmast, holding a bucket and a brush. He was looking straight at us. I dipped my head so my hair would fall back in front of my eyes. I hoped Miss Ryan would turn away from him, but to my horror, she spoke to him directly. "Doing well out there, Grebe?" she called out. He blinked, startled by the sound of his own name. Yes, miss. Doing well, thanks." "Good to hear it." Grebe looked very uncomfortable, as if he wasn't supposed to be speaking with us while he was on watch. "Well, I better get on with it. Good day, miss." He bowed to Ryan. When he lifted his head, he looked right at me. I held my breath behind my hair, but didn't turn my face away. I had to know for certain if he would recognize me. His eyes narrowed just slightly, and his brow furrowed, crinkling the scar on his forehead. But then he looked at Ryan again, shook his head, and left to go about his duties. I let my breath out, relieved for the moment. Once Grebe had walked out of earshot, I turned back to Ryan. "Do you know that boy, miss?" She nodded. "I've been playing cards at night in the galley with the crew. Grebe plays dismally. Owes me a fortune already." I knew the crew played cards. I could hear them from my room at night. But I couldn't imagine someone like Ryan mingling below decks with the others, drinking their sour wine. Ryan must have noticed my confused look, because she added, "We don't actually play for high stakes. They're on sailors' pay, after all. It's simply a way to keep up my card game and avoid boredom. And I like hearing their stories. Everyone scoffs at sailors' tales, but there's always something to learn from them if you know what to listen for." I wanted to ask her more about Grebe, but before I could figure out how to phrase my question, we heard the bells ringing from the top deck above us. Ryan arched one thin eyebrow. "That's the all-hands call. Is something wrong?" "They usually don't ring the call otherwise." She smiled at me again. "I'm going back down to the main deck, but I do hope we get to speak again, little sister." She winked and cupped a hand under her bob of thick hair, and then she left me, her jacket fluttering behind her like a cape.